It doesn't hurt, Mom. It never hurt. That was what I kept saying, over and over, even when her eyes filled with fear. Dear viewers, I wish you a gripping and meaningful viewing experience. Enjoy. My name had been Liam, and the story began with a quiet house, a Sunday lemon cake cooling on the counter, and a small lump on the side of my neck that everyone mistook for nothing. It had been there for weeks, maybe months, a bead beneath the skin that moved when I swallowed and seemed to vanish when I tilted my head just right. My dad joked that I finally had a soccer bump, the kind boys got when they ran too hard into life. I laughed because I wanted to, because laughter made adults stop worrying. But in the mirror, when the bathroom fan hummed, I watched that little rise, the oval under the surface, and I touched it with the careful curiosity that children saved for scabs and loose teeth. It didn't hurt. That was true. And because it didn't hurt, we waited. The first change had been small, like most important changes. My shirt collar caught on it when I pulled a hoodie over my head. Then my best friend asked what it was. Then it showed in pictures from my aunt's garden party, a gentle swelling that the camera loved for being imperfect. My mother, who noticed details for a living, said it looked a little larger. She said it softly, the way people mentioned a drizzle before a storm. She pressed 2 fingers to it while I sat on the couch with my game paused, and for the first time I saw her press not as a mom but as someone searching for a hidden door. "It's not tender?" she asked. I shook my head. She looked at my father. He looked away. The pediatrician's office smelled like hand gel and paper. I counted thumbtacks on the corkboard while Dr. Patel talked to my mother about infections that came and went without a fuss, about lymph nodes that swelled to do their jobs and then retreated to sleep. She asked if I had been sick lately. I had been, once, with a runny nose and a cough that made my chest feel like a rattle. It had passed the way childhood colds passed, quickly, with orange juice and cartoons. Dr. Patel pressed the lump. She hummed. She asked me to turn my head and swallow. She hummed again. "We'll do an ultrasound," she said, and her voice held that brightness clinicians used when they wanted parents to know they were careful, not frightened. In the dim ultrasound room, a nurse warmed clear gel between her palms. The machine woke with a soft electronic sigh, and the screen flickered into a blue-gray world that did not belong to me. The probe slid along my neck. The gel felt like a cold idea spreading. I watched the monitor because watching felt braver than closing my eyes. Shapes appeared, grainy ovals, the kind they showed in books when they talked about the moon. The technician moved the probe with small, precise motions, pushing slightly, angling, pausing to take measurements. The measurements mattered. I saw the way her eyebrows knit together, just for a second, the way a person listening to a distant noise tilted their head. Mom squeezed my hand. Dad stood with his arms folded, the posture he used when something in the house broke and he'd already called the plumber. The technician smiled at me and said I did great and wiped the gel away with a towel that smelled like detergent. We walked back to the waiting area where a cartoon about a talking train tried to sound cheerful enough for all of us. The radiologist took longer than cartoons usually took. When Dr. Patel returned, she held the printouts and said, "I think we should get a better look with an MRI, just to be thorough." Thorough meant we were not guessing. Thorough also meant that guessing felt dangerous. Mom cried in the parking lot very quietly, the sort of crying that never told you what the tears were about. Dad rubbed his jaw and said that technology showed too much, that when he was a kid they would have called it a swollen gland and told him to drink water. But even he did not sound convinced. The drive home took forever. At dinner, the salt tasted like a question. All night, the lump pressed not against my skin but against my mind. The house clicked and settled, the refrigerator hummed, a distant siren threaded through the street, and my mother stood in the doorway twice, thinking I slept when I didn't. "It doesn't hurt," I told the dark, the ceiling, myself, as if pain were the judge and the jury. The MRI came with its own ballet of forms and bracelets and safety questions. A technician asked if I had metal in my body. I shook my head and thought of coins and toy cars and the feeling of magnets snapping to the fridge. The machine lay like a white tunnel, a mouth that sang. They gave me headphones. They told me to hold very still. The noise was not music, it was insistence. Clanging, thumping, a factory where images were built from patience and physics. I learned to hold my breath when they asked, to be a small statue that belonged to no one but the moment. The skin ended with the sense of a secret being printed somewhere else. The ENT specialist, Dr. Reinhardt, had eyes that belonged to a cabinet maker. Any stranger could see the care for edges, for alignment, for what hid beneath glossy surfaces. She studied the images and tapped a pencil on the desk. The structure sat deep to the sternocleidomastoid, she said, and my mother nodded as if those sounds were bricks she could fit into a wall. I watched the screen. I watched the outline that was me, the way a single shape could hold many possibilities like a magician's hat. It looked multiloculated, she said. There was a cystic component. The borders raised questions. She spoke gently, translating without condescending, telling us of branchial cleft cysts that sometimes lingered from embryology like forgotten blueprints. She spoke of parotid glands and lymph nodes, and without naming it at first, the worry that sat in every adult throat when a child's body offered a riddle. When she finally used the word biopsy, it felt like a key sliding toward a lock. I learned there were two kinds of silences, the one in the waiting room, filled with magazines and clattering keyboards, and the one that lived inside your chest when you didn't want to look at the clock. Ours contained both. The fine needle aspiration happened with a numbing spray and a nurse who talked about her dog. The needle did not hurt much. The word sample felt too small for what it carried. In the pathology lab somewhere, a person like me, someone who loved to organize the world into answers, would stain cells and look for patterns. In the meantime, Dr. Reinhardt planned for removal because even a benign thing could be a heavy guest. School tried to pretend it had been normal. I wore a scarf even though it was too warm because the thought of questions from classmates made my face burn. My best friend, Noah, asked if I was okay. I said yes because he believed me when I used that word. At night, Mom sorted papers at the kitchen table as if order on paper would make order in our lives. Dad fixed the door that squeaked and replaced the light bulb and tried the small repairs that men reached for when they couldn't rebuild the sky. He sat beside me and watched a documentary about whales, and we liked the parts where the narrators whispered as if the sea needed reverence. I lay awake later and thought of the ultrasound image, the way it hummed with mystery, the way it turned me into a landscape. Pre-op morning arrived with edges. The sun came up, the birds performed their blunt little songs, and the hospital swallowed us in clean corridors and rounded corners that felt designed to soften bad news. The nurse wrote my name on a whiteboard with a coffee-strong hand. Dr. Reinhardt drew a small mark near my jawline, a map for the incision that would hide in a crease. "You'll be okay," she said to me, and then, to my parents, in a lower voice. It sat close to a nerve we respected. The nerve had a name that everyone said like a prayer, spinal accessory, because it helped raise shoulders and turn heads and do 100 quiet things that no one praised until they failed. I signed a consent I barely understood. Mom kissed my hair. Dad said he would be there when I woke. The anesthesiologist made a joke about spaceships and masks, and I smiled because adults loved humor right then. The lights above the gurney counted the seconds in flat white circles. I breathed the plastic smell that had put 1,000 people to sleep and let the room tilt and recede. In the ore, metal reflected a world so clean it scared me. I did not see the instruments in detail. They blurred, a silver garden. Dr. Reinhardt's voice threaded through the beeps and the measured language of machines. She told the team what to expect, spoke of planes of tissue and the caution near the sternocleidomastoid. A scrub tech called out instrument names with the affection that came from repetition. The overhead lamps turned me into a theater someone had rehearsed for days. And then the curtain of sleep fell. What happened next belonged to hands that had trained for years, the choreography of clinicians who learned to read the body's grammar without making it bleed too loudly. When I woke, it happened in layers. First came counting. Then came a throb that wasn't pain yet but promised to be if I called it by the wrong name. A nurse's face hovered, framed in calm. "You did great," she said, and people loved saying that in hospitals, not because it was always true but because it gave patients a place to stand. She checked the dressing at my neck, the small drain that lay like a short red sentence. She asked me to rate discomfort with numbers, and I chose the one that made her nod in approval. My mother's face arrived next, the relief in it so strong it made me blush. Dad stood behind her, his shoulders finally lower, as if he had set something down in a place where it wouldn't roll away. Dr. Reinhardt came by later when the hallway lights dimmed. She spoke in the vocabulary my parents could carry without dropping. "We removed the mass entirely," she said. "It was multiloculated, adhered in parts to the surrounding fascia, but the dissection went well. We protected the accessory nerve. You might feel some stiffness for a while." She mentioned pathology again, the timeline, the fact that answers took time because truth respected process. And then she said a sentence that settled into every part of the room. "I am optimistic." Optimistic lived side by side with dread in our conversations that night. The recovery ward had its own rhythm, the soft squeak of sneakers, the folded whisper of curtains, the crackle of plastic packages opening. I sipped ice chips while my mother spooned me something bland and perfect. The television murmured through the news, and I watched a weather map move storms across places we didn't live. Noah's text popped up on Dad's phone because he had given updates. "You good?" 2 words, and I swore I could hear his voice pronounce the good, like a question that wanted to run outside and kick a ball. Morning arrived with that hospital brightness that didn't belong to any season. Dr. Reinhardt tested my shoulders shrug. I could do it, not as boldly as yesterday, but enough to make my father grin. The nurse taught us how to care for the incision. She never used the word scar as a threat, she used it like a road we would memorize with our fingers. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot behave like an anthill, cars arriving and leaving, people doing ordinary things under a sky that had not paused for us. I thought of the first day when I told Mom it didn't hurt. Pain had been a compass all my life, and I had trusted it. But here was a new map, one where quiet things could matter more than loud ones. We went home with a folder and a rectangle of gauze that itched around the edges. The house smelled like us, laundry, coffee, pencil shavings from the kitchen drawer. Mom straightened everything, not because mess lived there but because order calmed her hands. Dad took out the trash even though it didn't need it. I stood in the bathroom mirror and tilted my chin and met my own eyes. A slight swelling, a careful line of steri strips, a shadow that would fade. I touched gently on the other side, the side that felt like it belonged to yesterday. "It doesn't hurt," I said, and this time the sentence meant something else. The call from pathology hadn't come yet. Time stretched, thinned, snapped back. In that space, friends visited with cards and gummy bears, and neighbors left casseroles because food had always been the language for worry. Gran told me stories about the little boy my father had been, how he once swallowed a coin and then wept until it appeared again, clean and unbelievable. Noah practiced being casual so well that it made me love him more for the effort. At night, I woke to the sound of Mom turning in the next room and thought of the screen in the ultrasound suite glowing like a secret underwater city. When the phone finally rang, it happened on a Wednesday that had tried to be ordinary. We sat at the table, all 3 of us, as if we were about to play a board game we didn't own. Dr. Reinhardt's voice carried across miles of wire in a tone that belonged to good news delivered carefully. She explained the findings with specificity that felt like mercy: a complex congenital cyst, inflamed, with no malignant features, a mass that had wanted to stay mysterious and had failed. She reminded us of follow-up appointments, and the way bodies sometimes tried to build back what had been taken from them. She reminded us of healing as a verb. After the call, Mom cried again, not quietly this time, and I let her because relief had its own sound. Dad put his face in his hands, then laughed, then covered his mouth because laughter felt too loud for the room. I stood up and walked to the window and watched a neighbor pull weeds, ordinary and heroic. I thought of all the moments when I had said it didn't hurt, and how truth sometimes hid in other words. It changed, it grew, it asked for attention. I thought of Dr. Patel and the technician and the radiologist and Dr. Reinhardt and the nurse who talked about her dog and the people in the lab who stained cells and told the future by reading the past. I slept that night like a stone at the bottom of a river, the water going on without me. In the morning, I moved my shoulder and felt the pull that would become a memory. I collected the permission slips I had missed, the homework I owed, the texts that told me I had been loved from a distance. When I walked to school, the air sat cool and patient around my neck. No one knew it, but it had been a cathedral for a while, a place where prayers had been said by people in masks. I stepped through the gate, and the world kept its promise by being itself. And still, pieces of the story kept arriving. I met another kid in the clinic who pointed to his own scar and told me how he learned to sleep on the other side. Mom joined a message board where strangers used the same vocabulary and made it feel like a village. Dad organized a fundraiser for the hospital because gratitude needed a direction or it misbehaved. Dr. Reinhardt checked the wound, her fingers confident and kind, and said healing looked beautiful, which was the first time that word had landed on my body without feeling like an advertisement. I wanted to ask her if she remembered the exact moment her hands had said yes to this work, the way mine would someday say yes to something and keep saying it when the room grew hot. "It doesn't hurt," I told Noah during recess when he finally asked. He nodded as if this had been the only answer that could build the next 10 minutes. We stood by the fence and traded facts about a math test and whether our coach would notice if we ran slower. Later, in the car, Mom asked how my day had been, and I said, "Normal." And she smiled so big I saw the girl she had been. Normal felt like a miracle dressed in jeans. I wished then, not for a different past, but for a louder way to tell other kids the thing I had learned, that pain told stories, yes, but silence did too, that bodies whispered before they shouted, that no pain sometimes only meant no pain yet. I didn't know how to make movies or speeches. I only had this scar and the way my hand found it when I thought of the ultrasound machine singing. I had this family that learned to wait without falling apart. I had these doctors who made a map in a room of light. And I had the sentence that opened everything, the one I had once used to end conversations and now used to begin them. "It doesn't hurt. Listen to the quiet things." That was what Dr. Reinhardt told me when she checked the incision and smiled with her eyes. Dear viewers, I wish you a meaningful viewing. Enjoy. Liam here again, and my mother and father stayed on either side of me like bookends the world could not push apart. The first week at home tasted like broth and antiseptic, like vanilla pudding and sleep that arrived in startled handfuls. I learned the choreography of recovery the way I once learned a new video game: short, careful movements, saving progress often, quitting before the screen went red. My neck felt tight when I turned too far. I learned to move from my shoulders, to point with my chin the way old men did when their stories turned toward the past. Dad pretended not to watch but watched anyway. Mom journaled in a notebook with a teal elastic band and wrote down every question that could help another family later. The follow-up visit with Dr. Reinhardt unfolded in that calm clinic room where clocks behaved and windows let in a square of sky. She peeled back the steri strips and said the words every patient treasured. "Healing nicely." She tested the shoulder shrug again. I lifted with more confidence and caught the flicker of pride in my father's face. She reviewed the final pathology in normal, precise language, not with drama but with respect. A congenital remnant, inflamed, margins clear, no evidence of malignancy. The sentence landed like a feather and a bell at the same time. "You'll have some stiffness," she said. "We encourage the scar to sit well in a crease." She demonstrated a gentle stretch that made my neck feel like a tied ribbon coming loose. At home, life recovered its old grammar and still felt new. Mom returned to work with her careful eyes, and yet she left post-it notes on the fridge. Reminders for saline, reminders for the next appointment, reminders to breathe. Dad cooked a pan of scrambled eggs and claimed they were a Michelin moment. He oversalted them, then ate the mistake because the house specialized in gratitude now. I learned to wear my scarf without apology, then to take it off without performance. When Noah came over with a stack of homework pages and a bag of gummy bears, he mouth-read the scar like a long word he had never seen in print. "Looks tough," he said, and I answered, "It told a story." And for once I sounded like someone older than my sneakers. School returned in a rush. The hallway noise, The smell of floor wax and pencil shavings, the way teachers wrote dates on the board as if time behaved when you numbered it. Some kids asked questions and some kids didn't. One boy made a joke he thought was small. It wasn't, but it slid off because I had listened to machines that sang louder. My homeroom teacher pulled me aside and said if I felt tired, I could rest in the nurse's office, and I nodded because tiredness arrived like a stealthy animal now, not always visible until it sat in my lap. At lunch, I chewed more slowly and watched the table talk swirl around sports and a math test and a rumor about a field trip that turned out to be true. Mom kept visiting that message board at night, offering strangers the map we had been given. She wrote about the gel and the grainy screen, about the words. Be thorough. About the way silence lived in waiting rooms and how you could breathe inside it without breaking. She answered a parent who asked if no pain meant no problem, and she told the truth we had learned. Sometimes pain arrived late to the party, sometimes it sent a postcard. She attached a picture of my scar only after she asked me, and I said yes because someone else's fear deserved a lamp. Dad surprised all of us by organizing a small community talk at the rec center. Not a crusade, not an alarm bell, just a simple evening called. Went to check. With lemonade on folding tables and a volunteer pediatrician who loved plain language. I sat in the back with Noah and watched parents nod at phrases like persistent change and imaging as information, not a verdict. When they opened the floor for questions, a woman with tired eyes asked how to navigate not scaring her child. The pediatrician said, "Children borrow our weather." My mom's hand found mine. My dad cleared his throat and thanked the doctor and made a joke about lemonade being stronger than fear. People laughed in that grateful way that made jokes into anchors. There was a scare in the second month, because fear never retired just because you wished it would. I felt a stiffness on the other side of my neck after gym, a tightness that told stories in a language I didn't yet speak. It had been nothing, just a strained muscle from refusing to sit out of dodgeball, but it carried the weight of old worry. Mom noticed my fingers go to the spot. Dad watched me in the rearview mirror and missed a green light. I saw the past climb back into the car. We visited Dr. Patel, who palpated and smiled and gave us the word, strain, with such steady kindness it became a door we could walk through. That night, I told Noah about panic as a reflex, and he said, "Like how I flinch when the ball comes even when I know I'll catch it." Exactly that. On a Saturday that smelled like cut grass and detergent, Dr. Reinhardt invited us to a hospital open house, an education day where kids toured rooms without fear. I walked past the ultrasound station where a tech showed how water bottles and gelatin could teach about sound. I saw the MRI model, a cutaway that explained the magnet without turning it into a monster. In a corner, a pathologist displayed slides of normal cells and abnormal ones, colors like a city at dusk. He talked about patterns in patients, and how often benign one. Mom listened as if these sentences replenished something in her. Dad asked a question about nerve monitoring in the OR. The anesthesiologist answered with clear sentences and a diagram that made him stand a little taller. I recorded a short message for the hospital's social page because a volunteer asked, and because the camera looked less like a machine and more like a friend than any we had met. I said my name and that I once had a lump that didn't hurt, and that scans told a story we almost didn't hear. I said parents helped, and doctors mapped, and that telling felt better than hiding. I kept it short because attention was a tender thing. The volunteer thanked me and asked if I wanted to see the editing room. I followed, and for the first time in months the word, inside, belonged to something that didn't scare me. At home that evening, Mom pulled her teal notebook and read a few pages out loud, questions she would send to the message board, notes on what to pack for imaging days, a reminder to bring warm socks because MRI suites ran cold, a line that said, "Ask about who reads the scans," and another that said, "Tell Liam he did great." I realized she wrote that last line even on days when nothing medical happened, as if normal days deserved applause too. Dad grilled chicken with too much paprika and declared it perfect. We ate on the porch while the sky turned the color of a bruise that healed, and a neighbor's dog barked the universe back into place. Summer edged closer, and with it came the rhythm of sunscreen and late sunsets and baseball games on television where the crowd noise felt like proof of 1,000 ordinary hearts beating together. I started running again, gently, learning to trust the stretch in my neck as a range, not a warning. Coach kept an eye on me without making a show of it. He said I could tap out of drills, and I rarely did, but the permission felt like a soft place to fall. Noah and I built a lopsided tree fort that looked like bad math and good friendship. When I reached up to hammer and nail and felt the pull beneath my scar, I stopped and adjusted and kept going. It told a story, I said, and Noah said, "Yeah, and now it's an exclamation point." We met a new family through the message board, a couple who drove from 2 towns over with their daughter, Emma, who had a swelling behind her ear that made her tuck her hair a certain way. We sat in our living room with glasses of water sweating into coasters and talked about wait times and the way specialists' calendars resembled puzzles. Emma asked what the gel felt like. I said cold and then warm. Like a joke that took a second to land. She asked if the headphones in the MRI helped. I said yes, but the machine still sang its own song. Dr. Reinhardt scheduled them for a consult the following week. When they left, Mom closed the door softly and leaned against it. Dad put a hand on her shoulder and said nothing because the best sentences often arrived as contact. On a weekend morning when the sun had not yet forgiven the street for being asphalt, we went to the farmer's market, the one near the library where vendors arranged peaches like small suns. A woman recognized Mom from the rec center talk and thanked her, then thanked me, then laughed at the embarrassment on my face and changed the subject to which tomatoes behaved in sauce. Dad bought too many cucumbers. We made jokes for hours about pickles and brine. I learned that jokes could be ladders you climbed to get above a memory without denying it. In the afternoon, I napped without apology. When I woke, my hand went to my neck out of habit, and then away out of choice. The second follow-up with Dr. Reinhardt happened on a cloudy day that made the city look like it had been erased and drawn again with a softer pencil. She asked about school and sleep and whether I still felt numbness near the incision. I did, a little, and she said nerves woke slowly like teenagers. She traced, with her finger in the air, the old map of the mass and what had sat near what, and I watched my parents nod and remembered fear and fresh relief. Before we left, she said something I tucked into the pocket where I kept important things. Bodies ask for attention in different dialects. You listened. My mother squeezed my shoulder. My father exhaled the way people did when they remembered to live. Back at school, our science teacher assigned a project on invisible systems, anything that worked behind the scenes to keep a thing alive. Kids chose internet protocols and sewer lines, and my friend Maya chose pollinators. I chose lymph, which made a few kids wrinkle their noses and then lean in. I made a poster with arrows that pointed to places under the jaw and collarbone. I wrote about filters and sentries and swelling as a sign of hard work. When I presented, I did not mention my scar until someone asked, and then I lifted my chin a little, the way Dr. Reinhardt had done when she drew the incision map with a pen. The classroom stayed very quiet in a kind way. Afterward, a kid I barely knew said his little brother had something like that once, and we stood there, 2 dots connected by a line no one else could see. Night softened. The refrigerator still hummed, the house still clicked, but that siren that once threaded the street felt farther away. Mom's teal notebook lost pages to the printer, to the mailbox, to other kitchens where other parents waited. Dad started running in the mornings, not far, just enough to learn his lungs again. He returned flushed and smiling and declared the world survivable. I logged the small victories, sleeping on my left side, looking at my reflection without flinching, telling Uncle Steve I didn't want to talk about it at the barbecue and watching him respect the no. Sometimes I replayed the ultrasound room in my head, not as a fear reel but as a museum exhibit with good lighting. The technician's calm hands, the gel-like cool truth, the way the monitor revealed a landscape that had always been there. I thought of the first sentence I spoke in this story. It doesn't hurt. And how it had been both right and wrong. Pain had not been the judge. The scan had been the witness. And the people, my mother, my father, Dr. Reinhardt, Dr. Patel, the nurse with the dog, the pathologist with the dust-colored slides, had been the jury that chose care over comfort, clarity over wishful thinking. Listen to the quiet things, I whispered sometimes when I brushed my teeth and tilted my head to check the line that faded by degrees. My mother overheard me once and said, "We will." My father heard and added, "And we'll still laugh loud when it's funny." And I nodded because both felt true, and truth worked best when it came in twos like that. The scar softened. The stiffness learned the room and left earlier each day. The world kept speaking in regular volume, but I knew how to hear its whispers now, and knowing felt like a new muscle I worked without anyone noticing. If it didn't hurt, why did it scare me this much? I asked Mom one night when the house finally went quiet. Dear viewers, I wish you a thoughtful, gripping viewing. Enjoy. Liam speaking again, and the people who had carried me, my mother, my father, Dr. Reinhardt, Dr. Patel, and my best friend Noah, kept showing up in ordinary places with the kind of steadiness that made ordinary feel like a miracle. The scar on my neck softened at the edges, a pale punctuation that no longer shouted. Yet the story kept breathing. It breathed in hallways, in waiting rooms, in message boards where Mom turned fear into advice, and in small meetings where Dad realized he liked being useful when the problem had a real door he could knock on. Emma's family visited again. She wore her hair up that day, a small act of courage that Mom noticed before anyone else. We sat at the table with water glasses that left rings we didn't wipe away because sometimes a mess reminded you that life happened while you talked. Emma asked about the or without using the word surgery. I told her what I remembered, the lights above like suns that didn't burn, the voices that stayed calm even when I felt small, the warm blankets that volunteers tucked around my arms like a promise. I told her how Dr. Reinhardt drew the map with a pen so the scar hid where the skin already folded, like a seam the body understood. Emma nodded the way kids nodded when they measured a thing not against courage but against whether it seemed survivable. The day of Emma's imaging, Dad drove us to the hospital so her parents could breathe between sentences. Dr. Patel met us in the corridor, her hands in her pockets the way people walked when they had nothing to hide. The ultrasound room looked exactly the same and completely different because this time I stood, not as the subject but as someone who knew the choreography. The gel made Emma flinch and then laugh. The technician smiled and said she did great. I stood by the door and realized the room had lost none of its power, only its ability to surprise me cruelly. It felt like a theater I had learned from, not a cave that had once swallowed me. In the cafeteria afterward, Mom spread napkins like a tablecloth and divided a sandwich into halves and then halves again. Emma's father tried to make a joke about hospital coffee and failed in a way that made us love him more. When the radiologist's notes came through the portal, Dr. Patel read them with her careful voice, complex but likely benign, further evaluation by ENT recommended. Those 3 words, likely, benign, recommended, sat on the tray like utensils we all knew how to use now. Emma watched her parents and then looked at me, and in that look there lived a quiet pact. We would name fear when it arrived and keep going anyway. At school, life kept happening at its chosen speed. The science poster about lymph turned into a real talk that teachers asked me to give to a small group who studied health systems. I stood in a classroom that smelled like dry erase markers and cataloged what I knew without turning it into a sermon. I said, persistent change, aloud and watched a dozen faces file the phrase away. I said, imaging as information, and realized I had stolen the sentence from the pediatrician at the rec center talk and made it mine. When I finished, a girl whose brother once had his appendix removed said it helped to know that silence in a waiting room didn't mean the world had stopped. Only that someone behind a door worked on an answer. Noah and I returned to our tree fort and finished it properly, which meant making it safe enough for Mom to stop pretending the yard had no trees. We hammered crossbeams and stapled a tarp against the wind. My neck tugged once and asked me to listen. I adjusted my stance and felt the tug turn into a suggestion. You okay? Noah asked, the way he always did, the question a hand he extended without making a ceremony of it. Yeah, I said because I was. We lay on the rough boards and watched clouds pass behind branches that split the sky into shapes. Noah said the scar looked like I had survived an adventure. I said I had. He nodded and, for once, didn't try to make it funny. Mom's teal notebook gained new pages and lost others as she mailed care packages to parents she had never met. A list of questions, a note that started with, "You don't know me," and ended with, "You're not alone." Dad learned the names of nurses at the clinic and greeted them like neighbors. He confessed one evening that he had looked up nerve anatomy on the internet and scared himself stupid. Mom laughed, kissed the top of his head, and told him the rule: research ended at dinner, gratitude began with dessert. He followed it more often than not. I learned that rules in a house worked best when they were made from love instead of panic. There had been one difficult afternoon in P when Coach forgot I had a note for modified activity and told me to lead sprints. I tried because boys tried even when trying made less sense than stopping. The stretch in my neck shouted. I slowed. A kid at the back said something sharp that boys said when they didn't know where to put their own fear. Coach realized and apologized, nothing performative, just a real apology that landed where it needed to. After class, he pulled me aside and said the team needed different kinds of leaders. He asked me to help set up drills for the younger kids this season. I said yes and watched the word open a new door where none had been painted before. Emma's consult with Dr. Reinhardt happened on a Tuesday. The clinic smelled like new paper and the kind of hand soap that hospitals chose because it felt clean without smelling like lemons. Dr. Reinhardt greeted Emma the same way she had greeted me, as if the conversation started from what Emma already knew, not from what Emma needed to be told. She drew another careful map. She asked about changes and patterns and whether Emma had been sick recently. She explained the plan as a sequence, not a threat: monitor, image, decide. If remove, then where the scar could live, nerves to respect, structures to avoid, the safety net of pathology that turned maybes into sentences. Emma's parents exhaled as if someone had cracked open a window in a stuffy room. I saw how a plan could be a kind of anesthesia all by itself. We all learned to love small celebrations. When Mom's message board friend finally posted that a mass had come back benign, we ate pancakes at dinner. When Dad ran 2 miles without stopping, he came back with a grin that made him look younger. We taped his time to the fridge like a report card. When my follow-up showed good healing and Dr. Reinhardt said nerves woke with time, we didn't crow about it. We bought flowers from a street vendor and put them in a jar where the sunlight could talk to them. Noah and I built a playlist we called Scans Are Loud. All drums and clatter and songs that made you want to move slowly through a hard thing. The second scare arrived in the form of a headline in Mom's feed: someone else's child, someone else's town, a lump that had not been nothing. Mom's breath snagged just once, the way a sweater snagged on a nail you didn't see. She closed her laptop and walked into the yard and looked at the sky. I followed. We stood there in the kind of silence that didn't need words. "We're okay," she said, not as a command but as a map of our own corner of the world. I said, "We are," and felt how powerful 2 words could be when they were earned, not guessed. Dr. Patel invited me to shadow for an afternoon. Nothing clinical, just a peek behind the desk to see how her day worked. I watched her listen more than she talked, write as if each sentence carried weight, and teach a medical student the way a carpenter taught joints and grain. Between patients, she asked if I had considered writing about my experience. I shrugged because writing felt both too big and too close. "Sometimes stories stitch what medicine cannot," she said, and the sentence sat with me like a friendly dog that refused to leave the porch. Dad's fundraiser for the hospital's Family Comfort Fund took place in the gym at the rec center where the floor squeaked and the scoreboard sat dark. Judging no one. He had organized a pickup tournament, half serious, half ridiculous, with raffle tickets and a terrible mascot costume borrowed from someone's attic. Noah and I sold lemonade and watched adults try to be young without breaking. Dr. Reinhardt showed up in jeans and a ponytail. She bought 2 cups, overpaid, and pretended not to notice when Dad flushed with pride. At the end, they announced the total, more than anyone expected, and people clapped the way communities clapped when they had found a way to turn fear into something you could touch. One evening, Gran brought a shoebox of photographs from when my father was a boy. We sat at the table and slid the glossy cards across the wood. Dad had the same grin, the same way of standing with his weight on one hip, The same urge to fix what could be fixed and complain humorously about what could not. Gran told the story of the swallowed coin again, of how he cried until the proof arrived, shining and ridiculous. We laughed until we cried because laughter and crying had stopped pretending they belonged to separate rooms. Emma's day in the OR came like weather, announced, prepared for, still surprising. Her parents asked if we would wait with them. We agreed. The waiting room performed its old magic trick of making minutes heavy. Dad told a story about buying a grill that had 300 unnecessary settings. Mom reviewed a list and then put it away, practicing the art of enough. I bought a vending machine snack that tasted like cardboard and comfort. When the nurse finally came out with the first update, going well, steady, Emma's mother closed her eyes and whispered thank you to a God that understood hallways. When Dr. Reinhardt emerged hours later with that careful, generous smile, my chest loosened. We removed it, she said, and protected what needed protecting. She did not say benign, yet because truth moved in steps. But Emma's father laughed, that honest burst, and the room inhaled as one. Later, when they wheeled Emma past, her hand lifted an inch, the smallest wave, and her mother tucked her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that could have raised a city from the ground. In the weeks that followed, life proved its point again and again, that it continued. I returned to practice and learned to coach younger kids through warm-ups that respected bodies. Noah and I found a new trail and got lost twice on purpose. Mom's teal notebook thinned, not because she wrote less, but because she gave more of it away. Dad installed a dimmer switch in the living room and declared the lighting surgical. We all groaned and laughed because the joke had finally healed enough to be funny. It didn't hurt had started the story. I told myself one night as I brushed my teeth and faced the mirror where a boy with a fading line leaned forward into a future he didn't have to fear to enter. But the scan told a different story. And now I understood what Dr. Reinhardt meant about quiet things. They had not been a warning only. They had been an invitation to listen, to ask, to stand together in a room where machines sang and people answered. I rinsed, leaned back, and felt the muscle along my neck loosen like a hand that had held on long enough and finally let go. "Promise me you won't ignore anything strange again," Mom said, holding my gaze like it might run. Dear viewers, I wish you a steady, heartfelt viewing. Enjoy. Liam speaking, and the people who shaped this story, my mother, my father, Dr. Reinhardt, Dr. Patel, Noah, and Emma, stayed right here, where real life kept its footing. The school counselor organized a small assembly called Signals and Stories, and my homeroom filed into the library where the carpet smelled faintly of old pages and lemon cleaner. I sat in the second row with Noah while the counselor thanked our brave student speaker, in a voice that tried not to sound like a spotlight. My palms sweated, not because public speaking frightened me more than the MRI had, but because this time I owned the story instead of surviving it. I told them about the day the doctor pressed my neck and hummed, about the ultrasound screen that drew a map I didn't know I had, about the phrase, "be thorough," and how it saved us from guessing. I kept names in the story: Dr. Patel, who translated worry into steps, Dr. Reinhardt, who drew a pen line where a scar could live without shouting, Noah, who kept a joke in his pocket and used it only when it helped. When I finished, the librarian wiped a tear with the sleeve of a cardigan that looked older than the building, and a kid from the back row raised a hand and asked if I felt angry at my body. I said no, not angry, curious. Curious felt like the truest word, the one that let me ask better questions and hear quieter answers. At home that evening, Dad admitted he had practiced clapping in a way that wouldn't embarrass me. He showed me 3 versions, too loud, too proud, just right, and we laughed until he forgot the difference. Mom pulled out the teal notebook and added a page titled School Talk, with bullet points like, "Sit second row, bring water, tell them the waiting room's silence had work behind it." She had turned our fear into a manual for strangers, and the manual kept growing because strangers kept becoming less strange. Emma's first follow-up landed a week later. Her parents texted Mom from the car with too many exclamation points, the kind you saved for good news: healing well, margins clear, benign confirmed. Mom covered her mouth with her hand and made that sound people made when relief arrived, wearing bell-bottoms and a parade sash. Dad high-fived the air. I texted Emma a simple, "You did it," and she sent back a picture of a bandage decorated with glitter stars. For a moment, the house felt lighter than air, and we let it float. That night we ate breakfast for dinner again, pancakes with a ridiculous amount of syrup, and Dad pretended not to count how many we stacked before gravity objected. 2 days later, I woke at midnight to a sharp itch near the incision, a nag that felt like a sentence someone forgot to finish. I pressed gently and felt a bump where a dissolvable knot had surfaced. Mom found me in the hallway mirror, eyes glossy with sleep and worry that woke too fast. She didn't scold the mirror or me. She made chamomile tea and handed me the mug with both hands. In the morning, Dr. Patel looked, nodded, and called it exactly what it was, a suture tail finding daylight. She trimmed it, applied a dab of ointment, and told a story about her own appendix scar that once itched like a mosquito with an agenda. We left smiling because names fixed more than ointments sometimes. Noah and I spent Saturdays coaching the younger kids at practice. I showed them a shoulder roll stretch Dr. Reinhardt had taught me and called it robot neck, so they would remember the motion and not the reason. A small boy with shoelaces that never stayed tied asked why my neck had a line. I said it marked where doctors helped me. He nodded as if I had told him where the out-of-bounds line sat on the field. Limits, boundaries, scars, kids understood maps when adults gave them without fear. The hospital released the short video I recorded during open house week. It lasted 60 seconds and lived on their social page between a blood drive poster and a nurse's retirement farewell. In it I said, "No pain didn't mean no problem for me." The scan told a different story, and listening changed everything. The video gathered a handful of comments, a grandmother who thanked the brave boy and the calm doctors, a dad who wrote that he scheduled an appointment for his son after noticing a lump, a tech who loved the shout-out to ultrasound. Mom read each comment like a letter delivered by hand. Dad replied to none of them because he understood that gratitude sometimes walked quietly. Gran brought over a casserole and a confession. She admitted she had dismissed a lump on her own wrist for months because it didn't complain. She scheduled a check that week and came back with a smile and the word ganglion, a lump with a name that sounded like a character from a fairy tale and turned out to be as harmless as the name suggested. We teased her lovingly, and she rolled her eyes and claimed the casserole had medicinal properties. The house ate and laughed and learned without making a banner about it. One afternoon, Dr. Reinhardt invited us to peek into a training session for residents. She believed families could see the care behind the curtain without fear. In a conference room filled with models and diagrams, she demonstrated nerve monitoring and incision planning, her voice steady, her hands drawing invisible lines in the air. She spoke about respecting planes, a phrase that sounded like advice for arguments as well as surgery. A resident asked how she talked to children without scaring them. Honest and scaled, she said. As much as they need, never more than they can carry. Mom wrote that down word for word in the teal notebook, then underlined it twice. That night, I sat at my desk and unfolded the science poster I had kept rolled in the closet, arrows to lymph nodes, notes about filtration, a corner dedicated to the phrase persistent change. I added a small photograph of the ultrasound printout Dr. Patel had given us, cropped so it looked like the moon. Under it I wrote, "Maps existed even when I didn't know I needed one." Noah peeked in, read over my shoulder, and said it sounded like something in a book people quoted. I told him he sounded like someone who hadn't done his homework yet. He laughed, confessed, and sat on the floor to start it with my desk lamp aimed like a stage light. A letter arrived addressed to me with shaky handwriting that leaned forward as if it tried to finish before the pen ran out. It came from a boy 2 towns over who had seen the hospital video. He wrote that he found a lump, felt embarrassed, said nothing, then showed his mother after watching the clip. They scheduled an appointment. He thanked me in 3 different ways, each more awkward and more honest than the last. I wrote back on loose-leaf paper with the margin doodles still on it, and told him what I wished someone had told me. He did the brave part already. Mom tucked a copy of my letter into the teal notebook as if the story needed an appendix. Summer took a deeper breath. The air grew heavy. The umbrella in the backyard tilted like a ship. The cat next door lay sideways under the azalea as if drama cured heat. We drove to the lake one Saturday with a cooler that groaned and a bag of towels that never fully dried. I swam carefully, turned my head to breathe, and noticed how the scar felt like a line the water forgot to read. Dad splashed me with theatrical understatement. Mom floated with her face to the sky, eyes closed, mouth soft, like a person who had survived a winter. Noah cannonballed near enough to scold but far enough to make the splash worth it. When we packed the car, I caught my reflection in the window and saw a boy with a story that finally lived under his skin instead of above it. At a check-in with Dr. Patel, she asked if I still touched the scar in mirrors. I said less. She said progress like to hide in small math, less, not none. She asked about sleep. I said better. She asked about fear. I said it shrank when I spoke it aloud. She smiled and said those sentences sounded like discharge instructions for the heart. On the way out, we ran into the ultrasound tech from months ago. She remembered my name, which felt like a magic trick powered by kindness. I thanked her for the careful way she had moved the probe, and she looked surprised, as if the memory warmed a place work sometimes neglected. The rec center turned Dad's fundraiser into an annual thing with a name too earnest to mock. Listen to the quiet. The banner hung a little crooked, the lemonade tasted better, the teams played with fewer fouls and more laughter. Dr. Reinhardt showed up again and pulled me aside to meet a resident who wanted to learn patient language instead of just procedural language. We stood in the corner by the Gatorade cooler and talked about clocks and waiting rooms, about how a parent's face changed when you gave a plan instead of a shrug, about the way children watched hands more than mouths. The resident took notes, as if this counted as a rotation. Maybe it did. Emma's scar faded to the color of a soft memory. She visited with a box of cookies that tasted like cinnamon and victory. We sat on the porch and compared lines like sailors comparing maps. She told me she had decided to join the art club because drawing quiet things calmed her more than shouting lines on a soccer field. I told her the club would be lucky, and she smiled in a way that made both of us believe it. Our parents traded the kind of glances that lived in the land between gratitude and exhaustion, a wordless handshake across a finished bridge. One more letter landed in the mailbox, this one from a nurse who had watched the community talk online. She wrote that her sister kept dismissing her own symptoms because they didn't scream. The nurse dragged her to urgent care, and a problem caught early received its chance to be boring. She ended with, "You all reminded me that quiet demanded attention." Mom read it aloud at dinner, and Dad raised his glass of water like a toast. We clinked, not because we had won anything dramatic, but because the ordinary had returned like a friend. "Promise me again," Mom said that night, softer now. I promised. I promised with the kind of seriousness that didn't need ceremony. The house settled around us, the refrigerator hummed, the street held its breath and then exhaled. I lay in bed and pressed my fingers gently to the place where history left a line. It felt smooth, like a sentence finished properly. The map inside me stayed, but it no longer hid. It guided. It guided me toward rooms where machines sang and people listened, toward kitchens where notebooks turned fear into lists, toward fields where boys sprinted and then slowed without apology, toward porches where friends traded scars and cookies and jokes that landed exactly where they needed to. And when the night grew quiet, I remembered Dr. Reinhardt's sentence, and repeated it because it had become the truest thing in the room: listen to the quiet things. I thought silence meant safety. It didn't. It meant I had to listen harder. I told Noah as we walked home. Dear viewers, I wish you a grounded, heartfelt viewing. Enjoy. Liam speaking one last time, with my mother, my father, Dr. Reinhardt, Dr. Patel, Noah, and Emma gathered at the edges of these pages like patient witnesses to a story that began with a lump that never hurt and a skin that told the truth anyway. Fall settled over our town the way a careful blanket settled over a sleeping child. The morning air sharpened, leaves learned to confess in color, the sky practiced its quiet blues. My scar faded another shade and then another, a pale reminder that the body kept records even when the mind tried to close the book. In class, we charted bar graphs for the weather station on the roof and argued about decimals that didn't behave. At practice, I taught the robot neck stretch to the new kids, and they copied me with exaggerated seriousness until it turned into laughter. Mom's teal notebook thinned down to a few bent pages. Dad's fundraiser became a date on the calendar, not a question mark. And still, the story asked for one more scene, the way certain songs asked for one more chord. It arrived as a letter on hospital stationery with the kind of font that looked calm for a living. Dr. Reinhardt invited us to a small ceremony, quiet, nothing dramatic, honoring volunteers and families who had helped with the open house and the community talks. It mattered, her note said, plain as bread. I tucked the invitation into my backpack and carried it around all day like a map to a place I already knew. That evening, Mom placed a card on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a lemon, and Dad announced we would wear something that suggested we lived in a world where ironing still made sense. The auditorium at the hospital was the size of a school gym cut in half and taught to behave. Nurses lined the aisle with programs. Residents clustered near the back like students who hoped to be called on just enough. Dr. Patel waved us over with the kind of smile that warmed a room without turning it into a furnace. Emma and her parents slid into the row behind us with the bounce of people who had learned to walk in good news. When the lights dimmed, a montage played, volunteers pushing carts of blankets, a child high-fiving a tech after a blood draw. Dr. Reinhardt drawing surgical plans in the air for a room full of residents who watched her hands as if they were learning a new alphabet. They called my name near the end, after a father who had donated books to the family library and before a nurse who had organized a drive for stuffed animals that did not shed. I walked up to the small stage. The podium felt taller than it needed to be, like most things designed for adults. Dr. Reinhardt handed me a certificate with my name spelled right, and both of us pretended it weighed more than paper. "For sharing your story so other families could find theirs," she said. It sounded like a benediction that belonged to a quiet church. I said thank you and meant it all the way down. Afterwards, in the hallway that smelled faintly of lemon and something clean without a name, Dr. Patel asked how school went and whether Noah still outran me on the field. I said yes to both and watched her eyes laugh. Dr. Reinhardt squeezed my shoulder, not the scar side, the other side, the one that had kept the weight for months, and told my parents I had healed beautifully. She said it to them because sometimes parents needed the sentence more than the child did. Mom blinked hard. Dad nodded once, the way men did when the right words hit the right nail. We visited the imaging wing before we left, because memory liked to take the long way home. The ultrasound room stood empty, lights low, the monitor asleep with its own screensaver sky. For a second, I saw myself on that table again, the gel cold, the probes sliding, the technician humming under her breath. Then the room snapped back to itself, the couch neat, the paper roll unblemished, ready to tell the truth for someone else. I touched the door frame and whispered, "Thank you," to a machine that had no ears. Maybe the thank you landed somewhere anyway. Outside, the air had turned crisp enough to make breath visible. We stood by the car and talked about dinner as if food could crown a day. Emma showed me a Polaroid from the ceremony where we both looked like we had stepped out of the same subplot. "I'm going to draw this later," she said. "Do it," I answered, and for once the permission felt like a gift I had earned the right to give. Her parents hugged my parents, those strange and the not strange people who had learned to carry the same kinds of nights. We promised nothing elaborate, no big plans, no complicated schedules, just text when you need, call when the quiet got too loud. It sounded like the right kind of future. The last follow-up came on a Tuesday morning that had misplaced its sun. In the exam room, Dr. Patel checked my shoulder shrug, palpated gently along the line where the incision hid, and asked about numbness. "Almost gone," I said, and she nodded as if she had expected the answer and loved hearing it anyway. "Any new changes?" she asked. "No," I said, and the words sat light in my mouth. She reviewed the notes, signed the chart, and turned to my mother and father with that steady brightness that had become our weather. "He did well," she said, the kind of sentence that stitched an end without pretending there hadn't been a beginning. You all did. On the way out, we ran into a resident from the training session, the one who had taken notes by the Gatorade cooler. He thanked my parents for a phrase he had stolen and used with a family the night before. Imaging as information. He said it had helped the mother breathe. Mom smiled with her whole face. Dad told him to keep the phrase. We had more at home. In the car, we sat for a moment without turning the key, the quiet settling like a soft answer. What now? Dad finally asked, not because he didn't know but because he wanted to hear it. No, Mom said. We live. We did. Living did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with early alarms and missing socks and breakfasts that only one of us liked. It arrived with math tests, with soccer practices that ended in mud, with Emma's drawing club putting on a small exhibit that smelled like glue sticks and courage. It arrived with the community talk becoming a page on the rec center bulletin board, steady and boring and exactly right. It arrived with Gran's wrist lump becoming a story we told and laughed at, a ganglion that sounded like a cartoon villain and behaved like an ordinary bump. It arrived with Dr. Reinhardt doing 1,000 careful things for 1,000 quiet bodies that healed because hands and maps and patients met in a room with bright lights. The school counselor asked me to write something for the health newsletter, 2 paragraphs, no drama, just advice for kids who noticed changes and didn't want to speak up. I sat at my desk, the scar a soft curve under my jaw, and chose words I wish someone had handed me at the start. I wrote, "No pain didn't mean no problem for me. It only meant I had to pay attention in a different language. If something changes and stays changed, tell an adult who will listen. Scans don't accuse, they explain. Doctors aren't there to scare, they map. Your body isn't betraying you when it asks for help. It's inviting you to listen." I showed Mom. She cried the quiet way and said it sounded like medicine. On a late afternoon that hoarded its last light, Noah and I returned to our crooked tree fort with a thermos of cocoa and 2 paper cups. The air smelled like damp wood and the kind of cold that prepared the ground for spring. We sat with our legs dangling, our shoes scuffing the trunk, the sky punctured by branches. I told him I still touched the scar sometimes without thinking. He said he still flinched when a ball flew high, then laughed at himself and didn't apologize. We both stared at nothing on purpose. "You ever going to forget it?" he asked, not unkindly. "Forget it, no," I said. "Carry it, yes. But lighter every day." He nodded and bumped my shoulder with his, that small collision that meant everything was fine. At home, Mom set the teal notebook on the top shelf, not because the story ended, but because we didn't need to hold it so tightly anymore. Dad slid the fundraiser banner into a cardboard tube labeled in his blocky printing, "Listen to the quiet." He winked and said, "See you next year," to no one in particular. We ate dinner and argued gently about which movie counted as a classic and whether pancakes qualified as a food group. The refrigerator hummed. The house clicked. The street exhaled. Later, in the bathroom, I faced the mirror and tilted my chin the way I had done 100 times and would do 1,000 more. The line under my jaw looked like the faint path a creek left after rain, not dramatic, just true. I touched it once softly, like tapping a page to mark a paragraph that mattered. Then I lowered my hand and met my own eyes. "It didn't hurt," I said to the boy in the glass, and heard the life that followed answer, from years that would keep arriving. "The scan told a different story." I believed both sentences and knew how to live between them. When I turned out the light, the room kept its promise by being ordinary. Through the wall, I heard my parents talk about a grocery list. On my phone, Emma sent a picture of a new sketch, 2 small figures on a stage, a podium too tall, a certificate that weighed nothing and everything. Noah texted a single word about practice tomorrow, run. I smiled in the dark. The scar rested. The map rested. The house rested. The story, at last, rested in the place where finished things went when they had done their work. And if you listened closely, you could still hear it, the quiet that saved us, not as a warning anymore, but as a way of living.